Sunt Adrian Bocăneanu și vă spun bun venit la o ediție Punctul de plecare realizată pe Skype. Invitatul meu, profesorul Doug Jacobs de la Southern Adventist University, are o carieră foarte bogată și interesantă. Totuși, în centrul acestei conversații este un eveniment recent în care a fost indirect implicat și care a prilejuit o mulțime de reflexii foarte serioase privind viața și credința, vizionare cu folos. Dear Dr. Jacobs, thank you for accepting my invitation and welcome to the starting point.
Thank you very much, Adrian. I'm really happy to be with you today.
Yes, a few weeks ago, I just seen your short article in the Adventist Review or Adventist World. I don't remember exactly, and I was fascinated by it for obvious reasons. And I tried to connect with you, and you were so kind to accept my invitation. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm happy to meet you, and I've never been to Romania, but I have many Romanian friends and students that I've had, and I really have a high regard for them and for your country. So I'm delighted to be able to talk with you today and hopefully make many new friends in Romania.
That's for sure. So as I mentioned, the trigger for this interview and for this connection was that article. The title was
Thankful to be alive.
To be alive. So let's start with this starting point. Of course, our viewers are not aware, most of them are not aware of that article and the story, the starting story. So would you like to share shortly the incident you described there, followed mainly by your own reflections? And yes, please.
I enjoy playing golf, and I like to go to the driving range and just hit golf balls. So this afternoon, and I believe it was February 17 of this year, it was about 4 o'clock. I got there 4:30 at the driving range, and they have like a little sidewalk, concrete sidewalk covered by golf mats, so that when the weather is cold or when there's a lot of rain and stuff, you can hit off these artificial grass mats. So I was standing there, a couple of other people were standing there. Across the street from the driving range, there is a car wash where you can drive your car through and get it washed and then pull around and vacuum the car out. So we were hitting golf balls when about 4:50 in the afternoon on this kind of cold, cloudy day, suddenly we heard gunshots ring out. And I'm not a gun enthusiast, so I didn't even realize what it was at first, but it was obvious in a moment as multiple shots rang out what was going on. The two people next to me started running for shelter nearby, and I thought, if there's shots, I don't want to be anywhere. So I dove down in the mud in front of this little concrete sidewalk-like platform, which was maybe just a few centimeters high, and just enough for me to get underneath. And as I'm lying there in the mud, the shooting continues, multiple shots. I look up above and I see on the road between the car wash and me, this man walking calmly down the road sideways, and he had his arms out in the classic pistol shooter's stance, and he was calmly almost shooting into a black Mercedes car that was in the vacuum cleaning area. Well, that was something that I had never expected when I went to a car wash, to the golf range. And then he and several other people jumped into two cars and they sped off. My two companions, they were young people, they were videoing everything. And they immediately called the emergency services. And within a few minutes, we had police and fire and medical people there, just dozens of them swarming all over the place. I think there were probably, the gunman on the road shot at least 9 times. The police marked 9 shell casings. I counted another 15 to 20 near the black Mercedes later in the car wash where they had marked those. It was 4 people who were trying to murder 2 people. They had followed them there to the car wash, and they had actually waited, watched them go through, and then drove up and started shooting at them. And I was within, maybe if you're talking within the gunman that was shooting, I was probably within 30 meters of that gunman. So it was very close to me. And that's basically the foundation for the article and what I was talking about.
Yeah, in fact, you gave us a little more detail compared to the article, because the article focused on insights and reflections and memories and inner processes and things like that. I think the first remark you made was about how traumatized you remained after that. If I visualized correctly what you described, the gunman was shooting in the opposite direction, not toward you. Yeah, so you are not in his.
If I were looking at it, I was behind the gunman, and the gunman was shooting. It was like a direct line between me and the black Mercedes, and he was standing in the middle of that line, shooting away. But when I looked up at him and I saw him shooting there, I realized if anybody was shooting back, I was in direct line of fire.
I see.
So I put my head down very quickly and just lay there in the mud.
Yeah, I understand it better. But at no moment you had the idea that you were a target.
No, although it's really interesting that 2 minutes after the shooting started, my wife called me on my cell phone, which was in my pocket, and it started ringing loudly. And I thought, if that gunman who's shooting right now hears the phone, he may turn around. So I grabbed the cell phone and talked to her, and she said, "You sound a little strange." And I said, "That's because I'm in the middle of a shooting." So we talked for 6 minutes. And when we heard the first sirens coming, then we stopped talking and I hung up the phone. After that event, I did not remember that she had called me. It took her pulling out her cell phone and looking at the records and saying, "I called you at 4:52. We talked for 6 minutes. And when the sirens came, that's when you hung up." Then the memory came back. But I wasn't afraid during the shooting. It was really interesting. I had no fear, like no personal fear of being killed. But what happened was that my memory was very selective. And some things, I remember that gunman, I remember what he was wearing, I remember thinking how calmly he was just walking along, shooting at someone trying to kill them. I remember thinking, I need to stay out of harm's way. But there were many things that then happened that I talked to other people in the area, and they mentioned that I had not observed. And I think I had seen them, but the trauma of the moment erased my memories. My memory was very selective at that point.
What are your reflections and your insights when you think on this observation that your memory was quite unreliable? In fact, after such an impressive event, you would expect the memory to be so vivid, so clear in every detail, and all of a sudden you realize that huge chunks of the reality were completely erased from your memory.
There's an interesting phrase in English, and it's the fog of war. And the fog of war is this selective memory that takes place in times of crisis. And I think it can happen in other traumatic experiences as well. There are certain details that stand out, and there are other details which our mind does not have the capacity. Everything is happening so quickly that our mind does not have the capacity to process everything at the same time. So it's like driving a car. When you start to drive, all of the details overwhelm you. And you get out on the highway and you might freeze. I remember I was in driving school in high school with another student, and the instructor had to slam on the brake because the individual, had kind of frozen and didn't have the capacity to push the brake down in a dangerous situation. So I think it's kind of like that. But as you learn to drive now, you and I are probably veterans of driving after many decades. And I just drove yesterday from Florida to here, many miles. It's about 9 hours. And basically, we're driving about 110, 120 kilometers per hour during that time. And, cars are around us, trucks are around us. We're listening to the radio. We take a phone call, hopefully on the car, not, holding the phone ourselves. So we're processing all these because we're experienced and our mind knows how to process it. When something happens for the first time, if you haven't trained for it, if you haven't prepared for it, if you're not somebody that has studied it, a member of an elite army unit that is trained in warfare would have been in that situation and would have remembered every detail because they had been through countless hours of training.
So that also brings some light on situations when people who have been in difficult situations, in conflict, in war, or in danger, major danger, they try to give a account of the events, and people around them tend to doubt their recollections because maybe some things are missing, maybe some things are out of proportion, and they say, no, you probably fabricated all this story. Have you seen this? No, have you seen that? No, I don't remember that. You see, if you were there, you should have known that.
You bring up a very interesting point. I have my second daughter. I have two daughters, and my younger daughter is a midwife, and she specializes in delivering babies, but also dealing with women who have suffered sexual trauma, whether they've been raped or whether they've experienced abuse. And in those situations, often, in part of the way we cope with trauma is to shut down because we can't handle everything at once. And I think in my situation, I learned a couple of things. One is to be humble and to not think that my memory is always accurate. And that's really hard for me. Maybe my wife's memory is better than mine about what happened in a situation. So I don't need to tell her that she's, wrong about this because men always remember better. I need to say, no, I might not remember the situation the same way that you remember it. And when victims of tragedy, whether it's sexual abuse, whether it's an accident, whether it's what I was involved in, especially with young children, this is something that scars an individual for life. And it was interesting. I felt no fear at first, but I began to experience more trauma the next day and the next day. In fact, the article you read, it took me 2 or 3 days before I could even write down anything. I didn't trust myself to write anything. So I waited a couple of days. And after 2 or 3 days, I posted my recollection with pictures on Facebook. And I had something like 130 something comments. So I had this huge response on Facebook. And one of the people was the brother of the editor of the Adventist Review online. And he sent the article to his brother, and the brother said, "Would you rewrite this?" So so that's how the article got there, but it took me a while because I was processing. I went back to the golf course 2 days later because I felt it was very essential for me to go back and to not be afraid of going back. But you know, when somebody's been, golf shoes have cleats on them and they get mud on them, and so somebody took their golf shoes and banged them together, and I was looking around like, where is that gunshot? A simple sound, but just little sounds began to bother me. When I'd go to the grocery store to get food, I would look at everybody suspiciously. And it changed me in that way as well. And I think that that's one of the dangers of tragedy, is that not only do we forget things, but also we begin to look at other people in negative ways. And I've struggled with that since then, with trusting.
Yeah, it's indeed so perplexing and worrying that not being a target, not being personally threatened, you still became a victim. An incident, it took just a few minutes, and you still carry with you the wound or the scar, and you have been transformed in a way, probably for the rest of your life. I can only try to imagine how it is for people they know they are a target, or people
Yes.
who live in areas of conflict for months and year after year. It simply boggles my mind. I can't even try to imagine how it would be to be in a place of war for year after year and to know you are a target.
I think for many people, especially for children, what it produces is probably, even in the way their brain processes information, it's physically altered, so that there is this fear factor that doesn't allow them to feel at peace. You and I have talked about the fact that I grew up in a religious family. My father was a minister, and he worked in the United States until I was 9 years old, and then he went to help with the Seventh-day Adventist Church's work in Pakistan. And when I graduated from high school and came back to the United States for university training, they went to what was then East Pakistan and soon became the independent country of Bangladesh. And they went through the War of Independence, where my dad was there in very difficult circumstances, and like veterans of wars, he didn't talk about it very much. But I know that he was in situations where his life was in danger. And I think for people that don't have a strong faith in God, for people that don't have the maturity of an adult who has that faith, that knows where to put their trust, it is devastating. And my heart went out, because I think the reason I didn't feel fear in the moment was because I had been through my parents telling me about their wartime experiences. I've had students that have been in the military in the United States and have fought in Iraq and other places who have seen combat. And they described what they did and the dangers of it. That's why I dropped down on the ground and didn't run, because I realized I needed to get shelter instantly. I've had police officers in churches planning our safety after the mass shootings that we experience in this country. And we've been talking about how to keep our churches safe. And they've told me of the power of weapons. So, an adult mind is able to process a lot of that. And I'm sure that one person wrote me and said, I'd be happy to teach you gun safety and how to go through all these circumstances. He said, I'm a trainer for special forces in the US military. And I haven't heard back from him. I wrote and said, well, I'm not really ready for that yet, but I'll let you know. But yes, I'm giving you a long answer because I've really searched with this, and I realized that I think that people are not just psychologically, but I think the brain architecture, our brains are very plastic. I've done some research in this area for a doctoral dissertation on aging. And our brains are very plastic, and especially among children, there is something called the ACE test. The ACE test is a doctor who was researching patients and wondering why, no matter what he did, they couldn't lose weight. And he developed this ACE scale, which means adverse childhood experiences. And he found out that many people, because of their adverse childhood experiences that they've gone through, they've experienced a level of trauma. And that trauma means that they react to life differently. The classic story, the first patient he had was a lady who was over 400 pounds. So probably close to 200 kilos in weight. And she was basically, through his weight loss clinic, she was able to lose weight down to 130 something pounds. So going from that, you know, that's like going from 200 kilos to about 60. So huge change. She looked beautiful. But suddenly men started paying attention to her. She had been sexually abused as a child. And her only defense was when men started paying attention, it brought back all of that abuse. In 1 month, she gained 30 pounds. She was eating in her sleep. In her sleep, she was awakening and eating, and then in the morning, she'd go back in and find cans open. She'd find things from the refrigerator on the kitchen table. And in 1 year, she weighed more than she had before she started losing weight. She had gained all the weight back because the weight protected her. The doctor thought the weight was killing her, but for her, the weight was protecting her against the trauma that she had experienced as a child. The test is a comprehensive test, and there are 10 different categories of childhood experiences that adversely affect people. There's a simple version with just 10 questions. Things like, have you been abused sexually? Have your parents been divorced? You know, did you experience drug use in your home? Things like that. And I one time had a married student who failed my class not once, but twice. So all the professors were like, this man is married, he has children, he has a wife, he's trying to go to school to become a pastor. Why is he failing this class? Why can't he get his act together, as we say in English, and you know, be more responsible? So I gave him the test. Now, if you have 3 or 4 of the 10 adverse childhood experiences, research has shown that it'll reduce your lifespan by 20 years.
Oh, man.
This young man, after he took the test, he texted me back and he said, I scored a 7 out of 10. I had a pretty bad childhood. He had had 7 of the 10 adverse childhood experiences that he had experienced. And I realized rather than condemning him for not achieving, he needed spiritual and psychological help and sympathy and someone to come alongside of him and help him to deal with these adverse experiences that he had as a child. You know, you and I in these situations, I had no fear that I go back to the golf range. I was there yesterday hitting a few golf balls because I enjoy it. I can hit the golf ball instead of somebody else. You know, and I'm not a violent person, but it's just a fun way to kind of get your exercise. And I I never even thought while I was there about the shooting
Really?
because I live in a safe area. This was an anomaly. It was an unusual event. And so I don't have that daily fear. But what if I was a child in the inner city, which is about 10 or 12 miles from where that place is? And what if I saw people on my street every day being shot? One chaplain at the hospital, I was telling him the experience, and I'm involved with some work at a local hospital. And he said, oh, yeah, he says people come in and say, oh, I was shot here and my cousin was shot over here. And, you know, for them, it's a daily fact of life of living with that fear. That has a negative effect.
Yeah, it's very mind-opening, or how to say, because we meet people and we expect all of them to behave, in a certain way, to speak in a certain way, to behave and everything, but we have no idea where they are coming from, what were their experiences in their childhood or just yesterday. Uh, Students go to school, tests are standardized. It doesn't matter where you come from, it doesn't matter you had something for breakfast or you are hungry, everything is standardized and you are expected to perform and to do it right. But every person has a completely different history and background and situations, and we just wonder who is there to pay attention to that, to show compassion and understanding, to mend the broken hearts, and to yeah, society became so demanding and impersonal, and people are hurting and wounded and crying and grieving, and yeah.
You know, we're taping this program just a few days after Easter.
Yes, here in the States, yeah.
Yeah, in the United States, our Easter time was just this last Sunday, and I know that the Eastern date for Easter is a little different, but this Easter date reminds me of the prophecy of Jesus' suffering and death in Isaiah 53, and it says that he was an individual who was pierced for our transgressions. It says there. And it talks about the fact that he was oppressed and afflicted. And he was despised and rejected by men as well. So Jesus is one, I believe, that when he saw people, he looked at them and he knew what they had been through. I think of some of the people that he treated gently, you know, and it talks in Isaiah about a bruised reed that he would not break. And I think of the woman caught in the act of adultery. And, you know, the priest must have had someone to go to set her up. And then they walk in and they drag this woman out in the public square and say, this woman has been caught in the very act, which in itself is a form of sexual abuse, just to reveal this fact. And Jesus doesn't answer. He just kneels down in the dust and he writes with his finger in the dust. And some have suggested that he was writing the sins of the priest. But even there, he was writing it in a way that was kind to them because nobody else could see it. And as soon as the feet crossed over that, their sins would be erased. He didn't have a permanent record there. And the oldest...
We don't know the content of those revelations. Yeah.
But it's interesting, the oldest ones slip away first, the most prominent ones, because they had the most to hide. Here in the United States, there's a representative in our government, in our Congress, and he has been somebody that has condemned other people, and he's been very prominent, you know, and all of a sudden it's revealed his own sexual sin. And it's interesting that many times when we condemn people, we're condemning what we don't like in ourselves. So Jesus looks at the woman after everybody's gone away in the story, and he says, "Where are your accusers?" And she says, "There's no one here left." And he said, "Neither do I condemn you, but go and sin no more." And so I really feel in these situations, you asked me a question before the interview started, and this whole situation has made me feel more humble and less willing to condemn others. And one of the ways is, even in the use of guns as protection, because I've told you that I don't believe in using a weapon against someone else. But as I saw that man there walking along the road, shooting into a car, trying to kill people, and he did it so calmly. His back was turned to me, and he didn't know I was there. And I've thought many times, if I had a weapon, and I knew how to use it, would I have used it to shoot him? So I'm at a point now where I've still made the decision, no, I choose not to defend myself with a weapon. Although that's my right here in the United States to carry a weapon and defend myself. But I choose not to do that, but I'm also not quite so willing to condemn others in the situation, because I realize that sometimes taking out one person might save the lives of many others. So I feel like what you're saying is very true. This whole incident has made me realize how much better we don't shoot people, most of us. We don't go out and try to murder them. But how often do we destroy them with our words and our actions?
Or neglect, or let's return to what you just said. Of course, for the rest of the world, for Europe, this idea of almost every citizen here having many times multiple guns, and not only small but even like war style firearms is inconceivable. And, however, here in America, this is quite common. How do you explain this huge difference between the European mind and the American mind in this respect?
Well, there's several reasons. When America was first settled, it was a very wild country. And so every person had a weapon to hunt with and provide food. There was also, from the very beginning, this battle, understandable battle, between the Native Americans and the settlers. And as the settlers pushed west, that battle became even stronger. For instance, right here where I live in Chattanooga, Tennessee, was an area close to one of the great tribes of Indians in this country, the nation of the Cherokees. The Cherokee Indians were a group that actually they had their own language and their own script, and were very industrious people. But the settlers came in, and one of the sad chapters in American life is they forced the Cherokees to go all the way to Oklahoma, hundreds and thousands of miles of walking. Many of them died on we call this the Trail of Tears. And there are many places that I've been to in this area that are historical markers for this tragedy in American life. So every person had a weapon for two reasons. One is for hunting, and one is for self-defense. One of the problems in the Civil War was that the people, especially in the southern United States, were used to hunting, defending themselves. They were very comfortable with weapons. By the time of the Civil War in the mid-1800s, the northern areas of the United States had become more civilized, like Europe, and settled, and people were not used to having weapons. So it was very hard for the North to subdue the South in the Civil War, because of the fact that many of the Southern fighters were people that lived off the land. They knew how to hunt, they knew how to fish, they knew how to find their way in the wilderness. Also, in the American Constitution, you know, when we declared our independence in 1776, we didn't have a formal constitution. We had what was called the Articles of Confederation, a very loose document that didn't work very well. So we had a constitutional convention. The colonies came together and they created the great document that is our American Constitution. But they needed some amendments to help. And so they formed 10 amendments at the first that were part of it. The First Amendment has been a guiding light for the entire world. And that First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So what came in America with the First Amendment was the freedom from state control of religion. That meant that every individual had the right to worship God the way they wanted to. Congress could not establish a religion as a state religion, nor could it prohibit the free exercise of religion. You couldn't tell people you can't worship that way. So freedom of religion, as even though we have many challenges, I think is still very strong in the United States. The Second Amendment is where our issues with guns come in, because the Second Amendment says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So they had just fought a Revolutionary War in which it was individual people banding together to fight the organized British. And so deep in our psyche was the idea that every individual has the right to bear arms. Now, we've had a lot of battles, whether that meant the states could have a militia or whether it means that every individual could have a weapon. And our Supreme Court has declared that it means that every individual has the right to a weapon. Now, do they have the right to every weapon? That's still a big matter of discussion in American politics at this moment, because as you know, we've had 3 mass shootings recently in the last month, and one very close to you in the Atlanta area where 9 women were gunned down by a conservative Christian who had issues with sexual temptation. So what's happened is that many people here feel that owning a weapon is their right, and the right of self-defense is one that is very strong. So that's a battle that we're still fighting, and it all stems back to our frontier wilderness and to our War of Independence and to the Civil War.
You are part of the same culture, however, you decided not to use your right to bear and use an arm. What are the reasons for your choice, for your decision?
Well, there's several reasons for my choice. And, you know, when I was a young man, I started college in 1969. I turned 18 that fall. So the next year, my name went into the draft lottery, and they picked out people that would be drafted to go to Vietnam to fight in the jungle. That was a very traumatizing war. I was just talking with a friend who was a special forces soldier and was tasked after the Vietnam War ended with securing U.S. assets in those areas. And he still suffers trauma from many of the things that he did during that time, things he had to do to keep his company of soldiers alive. So I didn't want to go. And because I was studying theology, I didn't have to go. They allowed ministers to not go in the draft. And also my number was very high in the lottery. It was 362. So that meant out of all the people born in the year that I was born, 361 would go before I would into the draft. And but I have several problems with killing someone else. First of all, God is the creator. and God created life, and Satan is the one, or Lucifer in the Bible, who rebelled against God, who wants to destroy life. So I feel like if we follow God and he's the creator, he's the only one that has the right to take life. And I don't have a personal right to take another person's life that God has given to them. Now, the Bible is very clear in St. Paul that the state, God has delegated to the state the right to take life if a person has forfeited that life through murder. And the Bible is very clear in that area. But I'm not a government. I'm not a judge. I'm not a jury. I don't have the right to do that. So that's reason number one. The second is God's sovereignty. When I take someone else's life, I take away God's ability to judge. How do I know if that person is saved or not? And if I kill them, I know my personal relationship with God, and I'm secure in that relationship. So I would rather die myself than to take someone else's life who may not have had the chance to accept Jesus Christ as their Savior.
That's very, very profound. Very, very profound. It's the first time I hear an argument from this perspective.
Now, that argument, Adrian, has a challenge, and that is the one I experienced lying in the mud behind the concrete, because that guy was trying to take someone else's life. So do I have a right? And this is what many Christians say, and this is where I'm less likely to condemn them today. What if I'm taking a mass shooter, and he's trying to kill others? What about my family? So those are questions. There's no, you did an interview that I watched with Herbert Blomstedt, the great Swedish conductor of classical music. And he said in there that we never have the truth. We're always approaching the truth. And in the Bible, I find that there is always, truth is often between two poles. So you have God's justice on this side, and you have God's love on this side. Now, somewhere in the middle, what is just and what is loving have to come together. And we as Christians, our Western minds, we struggle with grayness or complexity. We want black and white answers, logic. But the Eastern mind is more comfortable with some ambiguity. And in the Bible I've studied, I've taught preaching, and I've taught narrative preaching, the stories in the Bible. And when you look at the stories in the Bible, God doesn't give us easy answers. Often he asks more questions than he gives answers. So I know where I stand on this issue, but I don't know always where everyone should stand. Now, a third reason, along with God's sovereignty, there's a story that I preached on one time, and it's stuck in my mind a lot. It's the story of Elisha, the prophet, and his servant while they're staying in the city of Dothan. And the Syrian king comes to try to capture Elisha, because Elisha has been, as a prophet, telling the Israeli king where the Syrian king is going to attack him and ambush him. And every time the Assyrian king comes in and tries to ambush the Israeli king, Elisha's already told and they're waiting for him. So he says, there's got to be a traitor in our midst. And somebody says, oh no, it's Prophet Elisha. He knows what you say in your bedroom. So the Syrian king says, well, go find him and capture him. He wasn't thinking that if somebody knew the words that the king said in his bedroom, he would already know what's going on, right? So Elisha's calm about the whole process. He's sleeping soundly, and early in the morning, the servant gets up and goes outside and sees the whole small town of Dothan surrounded by the Syrians. And he comes in crying, oh, my Lord, what shall we do? And Elisha says, don't worry, those who are with us are more than those who are with them. That's one of the great lines in the whole Bible. And then he prays and he says, open my servant's eyes. And God opens his eyes and he sees chariots of fire surrounding the Syrians. So the Syrians thought they had Elisha surrounded, but they were the ones that were surrounded. Now, when you think about this, where did Elisha get this confidence? In chapter 2 of 2 Kings, he had seen his master Elijah go up to heaven. And he had seen the chariots of fire already. God had opened his eyes and he knew. When we've had a vision of God, when we have seen God and his protection around us, and I saw that with my parents' experience going through a war in Bangladesh. I saw that with my students that had survived in Iraq, who had had God help them. I then was able at the point where I was to say, those who are with me are more than those who are out there. I don't need to defend myself because God has a far better way of defending me than I do. You know, I didn't know if I shot at that guy. I didn't know when I saw him shooting whether he was one of the bad guys or if he was somebody firing at the bad guys. I didn't know whether he was good or bad. This ambush took place in the car wash, the vacuum cleaning area, and there were people all around the car. There was a poor older gentleman in a blue pickup truck, and somebody else later told me he was within 20 feet of where the shooting was taking place, and he got in his truck, and then he didn't feel safe there, and he got out of his truck. You know, a bullet can hit something metal or concrete and glance off and kill somebody else. I didn't have the ability in there, but God has a much better ability to judge. There's a wonderful story I heard some years ago. I was a pastor and I had many Filipino members of my church down in Florida. And I went to visit a really older gentleman that was dying, and they said this man was a pastor during World War II, and he was captured by the Japanese. And the Japanese were ready to execute him. So whether they were wanting to make an example or whether they didn't have a lot of ammunition, they decided to execute him by killing him with a pipe. So they brought him out in his underwear on the town square in this area of the Philippines, and the Japanese officer grabbed this big heavy metal pipe to hit him in the head and kill him. And as the Japanese officer swung the pipe broke into pieces and fell on the ground. And the Japanese officer was so startled by that he ran away. Well, here's the poor Adventist pastor, the Christian pastor, standing in the town square in his underwear. And it's on the day of worship. And so he did the only thing he could. He walked 25 miles home and about 40 kilometers home in his underwear and surprised his family that God had delivered him on the day that they were praying for him in church, that God had saved his life. And I was sitting in the very room with this man. And I said, as he was there finally dying in his 90s, I said, why would I defend myself when doesn't God have a sense of humor the way he does things? I just think of that pipe breaking in pieces and the officer fleeing in terror, the same way that Nebuchadnezzar was in terror when he saw the three Hebrews in the fiery furnace not being burned up, because he saw a greater power at work than he had. And I know I'm taking a lot of reasons here, but that's another reason. I'm also that way because I believe in the sixth commandment. Many translations of the Bible, I'm not sure what it does in Romanian, but in English, some say thou shalt not murder. But I take that to mean thou shalt not kill. And people say, well, if you're not murdering, as long as you're self-defense, it's okay. I don't like to kill anything.
In Romanian, we don't have any difference. It doesn't make any difference in Romanian.
Yeah. So the idea is, now there's situations where because of sin, one day I had a skunk that was in my yard and it had something terribly wrong with it. I didn't know whether it had rabies or what it had. But my neighbor had a 22 rifle, 22 caliber rifle, and he knew how to use it. So he came over and he shot the skunk for me because it was a danger to itself, to everyone else. So it's not that I don't believe in killing anything, but I don't believe in killing for sport. I don't believe in killing needlessly. And so that's a reason. And finally, Jesus said, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. He gave up his life to save others. And so I believe as Christians, we need to follow that example of Jesus, that we'd be willing to lay down our life for others rather than to lay down other people's lives for ourselves. And so that's a long answer to your question, but it's something I've had to think a lot about.
Sure. In European countries, you don't need necessarily to go through all this process because normally it's illegal to have a firearm. But here in America, one needs to make up his or her mind because this is so prevalent.
But I think in other countries, it's also important to have thought this through and decided where you're going to stand. Because what I found in my situation was, unless you've prepared ahead of time, you don't know what to do. So one of the things I learned is the importance of making sure that we live, how much time do we have left? Because I have a little story that I want to share.
We have up to 5 minutes, maximum 5 minutes.
Okay. I was a young man in college, and I went to visit my parents in the brand new country of Bangladesh 6 months after it was formed.
It was a very, very brutal war.
Very brutal war. Many people, as these people declared their independence, the Pakistan army trying to keep it, as in all wars, what happened was they would go into a village and they would kill all the men, rape all the women, and burn the village. And one woman was hiding in the rice fields with her village, and when her baby started to cry, she suffocated the baby rather than to allow the whole village to die. I mean, those are life and death situations that we can't understand. People would put hollow reeds in their nose and lie underneath the water trying to escape. My father was traveling by boat and could see villages burning all around him in those situations. So we were there a few months afterward. There were still many bombed out buildings and bridges were bombed and things were difficult. There were many weapons. Before that, they had no weapons in the country. And unfortunately, one of our missionaries building a new high school for Christian young people was murdered one night in the small place where he and his wife were living. So basically what happened was they brought the body to us, and we were with him in the hospital when he was pronounced dead, and I had to wash the body and put it in the casket and dress it because the American consulate provided the casket for us in that country. There were no undertakers.
Yeah, I read about that. At that time. Yeah.
There was an older missionaries couple with them, and the older missionary, Pastor Oliver Lang, had been shot in the wrist. His wife was so traumatized by everything that she lost her memory for 24 hours. She didn't know where she was. She didn't know what was going on. This dear lady who had been a missionary in India for 40 years, never once in that 24 hours that she lost her memory said one word that she would regret. She never acted in a way that she would regret. And she spent the whole time, even though she didn't know what she was doing, closing the eyes of the missionary that was killed, preparing food, doing whatever needed to be done. And after that, my experience was, Lord, if I ever lose my mind, let me be so trained to follow Jesus that whatever I do subconsciously will be the same as I would do if I had my mind. And I think that's really, the lesson I learned is in times of crisis, you are what you were. And so I believe I'm living in a preparation time when I'm living to, Paul said, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. And by filling my mind with Christ, I don't need to have the fear, and I don't need to have the worry in these situations, because I have a trust that other people don't have in those situations.
Yeah, thank you so much for. I can't think on a better conclusion of our conversation. In the valley of the shadow of death, some of the most amazing expressions of grace and faith I experienced.
Yes, that's very true.
Thank you so much for your participation. There could have been many other questions stemming out of this experience, but I want to thank you already for accepting to be interviewed again on some research you are doing at this time. In a few weeks' time, we'll meet hopefully again. May God continue to strengthen your faith and to fulfill his transforming work in you and in your students, in your family. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity to get to meet you and to get to meet your audience. God bless you.
Într-o secundă se pot întâmpla lucruri care să schimbe în mod radical situația noastră în viață. Dar ceea ce contează cel mai mult nu este ce ni se întâmplă și poate nici chiar reacțiile de moment în acea criză, ci cum ne rânduim viața înainte și după. Care este direcția în care ne mișcăm, cum îi lăsăm lui Dumnezeu spațiu să se manifeste în viața noastră. Iată un bun punct de plecare pentru gândirea și rugăciunile noastre acum, când ne pregătim să intrăm într-o nouă săptămână. Pe curând!